Video games! Pretty neat, right? Over the years, console manufacturers and game developers have been pushing the gaming industry to the breaking edge of new technologies. But I want to go backwards, damn it! The 6th generation of video game consoles were a magical time in gaming. Even for me, someone who didn't really grow up with these systems, I have a weird sense of nostalgia for this particular era of gaming. There are a number of factors that I think make this the most appealing console generation, so what better way to sort out my feelings for these systems than to talk about them for a monetizable period of time? Although there are plenty of games being released today, they just don't compare to the best that the 6th generation had to offer. Series like God of War, Ratchet & Clank, Pikmin, Animal Crossing, Halo, and many, many others first started out on the consoles of this generation. In my opinion, the most quality titles lay on the GameCube. Now, I know this is like saying I think Virginity is awesome, but there is a reason that people say the GameCube is arguably the best system that Nintendo ever put out. It's fun. This was an era in which Nintendo was still attempting to directly compete with Sony and Microsoft. And Sega, I guess, but they don't really count because the Dreamcast was discontinued before the GameCube came out. Whoops. And before they went all miles during the DS and Wii era. Because of this, the GameCube was a piece of actually competitive hardware, and the games looked phenomenal and played phenomenal as well. Super Mario Sunshine is a great example here, as Mario's movement is butter smooth, and the entire game looks like complete and utter sex. However, Nintendo still had to goof it up somehow. Because of their irrational fear of piracy, Nintendo decided to neuter themselves. Instead of using, an actual full-size DVD and putting copy protection on it, they instead decided to use mini DVDs. This meant that they would miss out on certain selling points, more on that later, but they also had far less storage for games, pissing off developers that were already pissed off from the N64 cartridge debacle. This left developers that weren't Nintendo with 3 options. 1. Ship the exact same game on 2 discs, driving up the price of manufacturing. 2. Cut out a lot of the features from the game and compress the hell out of it to get it to fit on a single disc, at the cost of the game's integrity, of course. Or 3. Don't even bother to port the thing to the GameCube, saving time and money. Not to mention not having to worry if your game appealed to the target audience of Nintendo fans. Can you guess which option most developers went for?
Money.
The games that did make it over to the GameCube were games that felt at home on the system, for the most part. Stuff like Sonic and Shadow the Hedgehog were dominant on the system, and even though they have counterparts on the other systems, the GameCube versions are often the most expensive today, likely for the good fit and nostalgia factor they have for a kid growing up in the early 2000s. Okay, enough about the Cube, moving on! The Xbox was a surprisingly good place to waste some time. Not only did Microsoft actually have exclusive games this generation, but most third-party games also ended up coming out for the system, which is more than I can say for the GameCube. However, most of these third-party games would release a year or two after the PS2 version, which was usually worth the wait because the Xbox had so much raw power and more extensive online support. Speaking of which, the PlayStation 2! Have you heard of it? Now you have. Honestly, the PS2 is one of my favorite consoles of this generation. Probably because it was the first console that I have memories of playing as a kid. Outside the nostalgia factor, Sony was having a great time! Being on top of the console world, getting loads of praise for being so awesome, killing Sega. Even though Sega was doing great with the Dreamcast, there was always this impending sense of doom that Sony would come out of nowhere and drop a massive bombshell. Well, seeing as the first PlayStation was the most popular thing since our Lord and Savior entered the world, most gamers were waiting to see what Sony had in store for the next one, and boy oh boy did they disappoint. From a software perspective, the PS2 had an infamous software drought when it first released, with it only being solved in the holiday of 2001. But did that stop people from buying the system? Did it save Sega? No, it did not. In fact, one of the many reasons the PS2 did so well is because of strong brand recognition and backwards compatibility from the previous generation. I mean, Sega and Nintendo were shivering with fear when they heard the term backwards compatibility. It was also helped by several other factors that I'll touch on in a bit, but if you really want to hear me talk about the PS2, there's a whole video dedicated to it on this channel, so go check it out. Or else. When games finally did come out for the system, they were some heavy hitters, and a lot of them ended up being exclusive to the PS2 that generation. I'm talking Final Fantasy X, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, and for quite a while, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2 were only playable on the PS2. It's also during this era that we finally get to see some original IPs from Sony, instead of just defaultly getting Crash Bandicoot. God of War, Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, rest in peace, Sly Cooper, rest in peace, and... Oh my god! You killed them all! Yeah, honestly, I forget how many IPs from Sony originally started on PS2, only to be unceremoniously murdered during the PS3 era as Sony shifted its brand image from being the console for all to the console for all with style. Although most of these franchises are dead today, they were a lot of fun and represented some of the best aspects that the 6th generation had to offer. Game development was dirt cheap, and the industry as a whole was being more experimental because of it. Games like Okami, Katamari Damacy, Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Crimson Skies, and many others like them would not have been made today. This cheap development cost also allowed for a whole other class of game developers to exist that have sadly gone extinct today. They were the AA devs! AA games were basically just AAA games, except without nearly as much polish. THQ and pre-Call of Duty Activision were pioneers of the AA scene, which meant they made movie license games. A lot of the most nostalgic games from the generation came from these devs, as well as some of the worst. There's actually a lot more I want to say about these AA devs, so I'm not gonna say anything at all, so I can talk about them in the future. I guess to make up for it, I'll talk about everyone's favorite undercooked fetus, the Dreamcast! I barely count the Dreamcast as a console, let alone one from the 6th generation. I think of it as more of a transitional console to the modern age of gaming, as although it has many of the features of the 6th generation, it was too short-sighted to become a full-fledged member of it. All it really did was show up, do good for a few months, piss itself when the PS2 got revealed, died when the PS2 launched. All within the span of under 2 years. Despite it all, I still love the Dreamcast, and it's one of my favorite places to play some of the more arcadey titles of the early 6th generation. The Dreamcast was a pretty big deal for Sega, despite the fact that it died so quickly. It saw Sonic into the third dimension with the release of Sonic Adventure, and the birth of the internet's favorite terrorist! Other games like Shenmue, Jet Grind Radio, Space Channel 5, Crazy Taxi, Soul Calibur, and of course, Seaman, made the console worthwhile for all 5 people that bought it. Once Sega told the world that they had no more money, and therefore no more Dreamcasts, they went to Microsoft in an attempt to have them build the Dreamcast into their upcoming Xbox system. Although this never came to fruition, Microsoft and Sega continued to have a close relationship throughout the 6th and early 7th generation, with Sega even developing follow-ups to Jet Grind Radio, Outrun, Crazy Taxi, and some others I can't think of, exclusively for the Xbox. There was also the GBA, but that's a whole other can of worms I don't feel like going down at the moment, so... It was also during this generation that consoles started to become more than just dedicated game machines. Now you can play the Guy game and watch porn on the same device! One of the biggest reasons the PS2, and to a lesser extent the Xbox, found so much success early on was because they were affordable DVD players. It allowed kids to lure their families into purchasing these systems, under the guise that it would be a DVD player for the family, of course. The one who gets the most credit for this approach is Sony, mostly because that's what sold PS2s during that infamous software drought we just got done talking about. The Xbox, although supporting DVD playback, needed the Xbox branded remote to do it. Although a lot of people thought this was weird, it was mostly done to avoid licensing fees for people that didn't plan on using their Xbox for playing DVDs. Wow, How weirdly thoughtful of them. Thanks, Microsoft. The GameCube also had a version that supported DVDs, the Panasonic Q, but it was Japanese exclusive and cost your first and second born children to buy, so no one bought it. However, one feature that was standard across the board this generation was online gaming. Now, for the most part, it sucked ass, but it was still pretty cool to be gaming online in a time before the golden age started during the 7th generation. Nintendo had the worst offerings, no shockers there. With there being no built-in modem for online support and only having one online game in North America, Phantasy Star Online, which they had basically nothing to do with. Even 20 years earlier, Nintendo was still way behind the curve when it came to online support. Good to know some things never change. Instead, the magic of the GameCube was a LAN adapter, allowing for up to 8 consoles and 16 players to play at once! Only on Mario Kart Double Dash. Kirby Air Ride and 1080 Avalanche also supported the LAN adapter, but only 4 consoles and players could be connected at a time, which is lame. Sega had surprisingly good offerings despite, dying before everything else came out. Sega hosted their own servers, included an upgradable dial-up modem with each console, and developed games with online support in mind. In total, there were around 30 games that came out in North America that had some sort of online functionality, which is honestly an impressive feat for a console that didn't make it to the War on Terror. The PS2 and original Xbox though, man did they have online games. The PS2 less so, having less must-play online games and having the same problem as Nintendo where developers needed to host their own servers for the games and not having the hardware baked into the system. But hey, for the time, doing anything online was incredibly novel, so it didn't really matter to most gamers. Also, this was a PS2, bitch! They can do what they want! And to those who cared that much, there was Xbox Live! A service so good it wasn't available when the Xbox released. Nope, if you wanted to play online with Xbox, you'd have to wait a whole year before it was released. But when it finally did, oh man, universal friends list, integrated voice chat, and Microsoft dedicated servers. Pretty much all the online features you know and love today originated from the original Xbox Live. Unfortunately, this also included the subscription model. Yup, that whole paying for online access was started all the way back in 2002. Many people were skeptical of it at the time, but once Xbox Live's killer app launched, suddenly there was much less complaints. This generation saw the utmost perfection of video game controllers. Except for the Dreamcast. And the PS2, since it's almost identical to the original DualShock. And the original Xbox. I mean, have you ever seen the Duke? The GameCube controller, though. Now that's a different story. They're still making the damn thing 23 years later. If that doesn't tell you it's good, what will? Despite its weird shapes everywhere, it just melts into your hands. It makes playing the GameCube even more enjoyable. I also just want to mention before I wrap things up that these are some of the best looking consoles that have ever been released. I mean, just look at them. Don't you want them? I know I've said a whole lot of nothing, but the 6th generation is really special to me. Not only is it my favorite generation to collect games for, oh yeah, I'm freaky like that, but it also signifies the end of an era. It was the last time that Sega competed in the console wars. It was the last generation before microtransactions and subscriptions forced their way into every aspect of gaming. Hell, every part of our lives. And although the next generation would have several great games and consoles come out, the magic was slowly fading away. After the utter dominance that Sony had in the 6th generation, they found themselves with a bit too much self-confidence, leading to a disaster with the PS3. Microsoft, although not winning the generation, at least sold more consoles than Nintendo, proving to higher-ups at Microsoft that Xbox was a brand worth keeping around. Unfortunately for the Xbox team, that meant sacrificing much of the freedom that they had during the 6th generation, with Xbox becoming more and more corporate as time went on. And Nintendo, well, they kinda gave up on the console wars, instead choosing to focus on making stuff they wanted to make. And although this worked out for a while, it would eventually come back around to bite them in the ass towards the end of the Wii's life and throughout the Wii U's. Sega struggled, even more than usual, with them still adjusting to becoming a third-party developer and having to rely on Sonic to make most of their money. Should have just become furry artists, then their money problem would have been solved. Point being, the 6th generation was truly one of the greatest lineups of consoles to be released, and much of the market wouldn't be what it is today without these incredible consoles, and the people behind them, guiding them down the right path. Wait. No!